Some encounters last only a few minutes, yet they can change the course of an entire lifetime. By saving a wounded stranger on a stormy night, she unknowingly made herself the target of the most dangerous people in the underworld. What she never realized was that the man she rescued had been quietly watching over her for years, and the secret he carried was far more deadly than any bullet ever fired. You are listening to a story exclusively narrated on the Dark Romance Stories channel. Relax and step into the world of love stories filled with mystery, emotions, and passion. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment to support us. This content is the property of Dark Romance Stories. Please do not copy or re-upload it in any form. The rain over the city fell like static, blurring the gold lights of the opera house into long, trembling streaks. Ophelia Rossi stood in the wings with her violin tucked beneath her chin, listening to the final swell of Puccini rise and break over the audience like a wave crashing against stone. She always felt it here, that strange, holy silence just before the last note, when 3,000 strangers stopped breathing at once. She let the bow fall from the string. Applause detonated through the hall. Backstage, she peeled off her performance blacks with the efficiency of a woman who had learned over 4 years of double majoring in medicine and music that time was a currency she could not afford to waste. Tomorrow, she had an 8 a.m. rotation in the ER. Tonight, she had played first chair for a sold-out house. She was 26 years old, and she had built her entire life out of the wreckage of not having enough. Not enough money, not enough family, not enough certainty. And she had built it beautifully, note by note, stitch by stitch. She changed into jeans and a coat too thin for the weather and left through the side door onto the wet cobblestones of the alley, her violin case slung across her back like a soldier's rifle. The city smelled of rain and asphalt, and faintly of copper. She smelled the blood before she saw him. He was slumped against the brick wall at the mouth of the alley, one hand pressed to his side, dark liquid spreading between his fingers and down the front of a suit that had probably cost more than her tuition. His head was tipped back, throat working, breath coming in short, controlled pulls, as if, even dying, he refused to gasp. Ophelia's training took over before her fear could. She dropped to her knees beside him, ignoring the rain soaking through her jeans, and pressed her palms over his to assess the wound. "Don't move," she said. "Don't talk. Let me look." He opened his eyes. They were the colour of a winter sea, pale, glacial, terrifyingly calm for a man who had a knife wound carving through his abdomen. He looked at her the way a predator looks at something unexpected in its territory, with interest, not fear. "You should walk away," he said. His voice was low, accented faintly with something Sicilian beneath years of polish. "This is not your business, Bella." "You're bleeding out on my business," she snapped, tearing off her coat and pressing it hard against the wound. "Hold this. Here, your hand, right here, press down." He didn't move. "I said press," she growled, and something in her tone, steel dressed as silk, made him obey. She dug her phone from her pocket with blood-slicked fingers and dialed for an ambulance. But even as the line connected, she was doing the math any second-year resident does without thinking. Pulse thready, breathing shallow, blood loss significant, but the wound angle suggested the liver rather than anything immediately fatal if she could stop the bleeding in the next several minutes. "No ambulance," he said. "You're joking." "I do not joke." His hand closed around her wrist, and for a man losing blood at an alarming rate, his grip was iron. No hospitals, no police, no ambulance. You'll die. Then I'll die quietly. She stared at him. Rain dripped from her lashes. Somewhere behind them, the opera house doors opened and closed, spilling laughter and perfume and the ordinary world onto the street, entirely unaware that 10 feet away, a man was choosing pride over his own pulse. "You're an idiot," she said, and hung up the phone. She would think, later, that this was the moment her life split cleanly into before and after, the moment she chose, in the space of a single held breath, to kneel in an alley beside a stranger who radiated danger like heat off asphalt, and save him anyway. "There's a private clinic 2 blocks from here," she said, already working, already thinking 3 steps ahead the way she'd been trained to. "My mentor runs it after hours, no questions asked, cash only. Half the MSUIC students go there when they can't afford insurance. Can you walk?" Something that might have been amusement moved behind his glacial eyes. "You have criminal instincts, Dottoressa. I have unpaid loans and a healthy respect for people who don't want their business explained to a cop. Walk or don't. But if you stay here, you'll be dead before the second act encore ends." He laughed, a short, disbelieving huff of air that clearly cost him, and let her haul his arm over her shoulders. He was tall, easily a head above her, and even wounded, he moved like something coiled, contained, dangerous. She felt the weight of him settle against her side, and thought with the detached clinical part of her brain that never quite shut off. 200 pounds, most of it muscle, and someone wanted him dead, badly enough to get this close. "What's your name?" she asked, as they staggered together down the alley, rain hammering the cobblestones. He was quiet for 3 full steps. "Enzo," he said finally. It wasn't his name. She would learn that later. But in that moment she believed him, the way you believe a stranger's lie, when you have no reason yet to doubt it. And she said, "Well, Enzo, try not to die on me. I have a shift in 6 hours." He looked down at her with an expression she couldn't name, something between astonishment and hunger, and said nothing at all. Doctor. Marisol Vane had run her unlicensed but not quite illegal clinic out of the back of a defunct pharmacy for 11 years, and in that time she had learned not to ask questions about the men who came to her door bleeding in expensive suits. She took one look at Ophelia's patient, one look at Ophelia's face, and waved them both inside without a word beyond "Table 2." For the next 90 minutes, Ophelia worked beside her mentor with a focus that blotted out everything else, the rain drumming on the tin roof, the low hum of the ancient sterilizer, the stranger's pulse beneath her fingers as she held pressure while Marisol irrigated and sutured. He did not make a single sound. Not when the local anesthetic proved insufficient for the depth of the wound, not when Marisol's needle pulled the muscle layer closed, not even when Ophelia, checking his vitals, pressed too hard against a bruised rib and felt him go rigid beneath her hand. "You are very quiet for a man who nearly died tonight," she said, mostly to fill the silence, because silence around him felt like standing too close to a live wire. "Screaming doesn't stop the bleeding," he said. "I was told that once, by someone who mattered." Sounds like a fun childhood. His eyes cut to hers, and for just a moment the ice in them cracked to reveal something underneath. Old grief, banked low, the kind that never fully burns out. "It was not," he said simply, and offered nothing more. When it was over, Marisol stripped off her gloves and studied him with the flat, assessing look of a woman who had treated men like this before and knew exactly what they were. "You'll live," she said. "You'll scar. Don't lift anything heavier than a wine glass for 2 weeks, and if that wound reopens, come back. Don't go to some back-alley butcher who'll get you septic." "Grazie, dottoressa." He was already reaching inside his ruined jacket, producing, impossibly given the state of him, a slim money clip thick with bills. He counted out a sum that made Ophelia's breath catch and set it on the tray beside the suture kit. "For your discretion and your equipment." Marisol didn't blink. She'd clearly done this dance before. "Discretion's free. The equipment isn't." She took exactly half of what he'd offered and pushed the rest back toward him. "I'm not in the business of getting rich off other people's bad nights." He looked briefly surprised, as if honesty in a room like this was a foreign currency he hadn't expected to encounter. Ophelia walked him out at 3:30 in the morning, the rain finally thinning to mist, the street empty and silver under the street lamps. A black car idled at the curb. She hadn't noticed it before, hadn't heard it arrive, but a man in a dark coat stepped out the instant the clinic door opened, scanning the street with the trained, unhurried eyes of someone who did this for a living. "Your driver?" Ophelia asked. "Something like that." He turned to face her fully for the first time since the alley, and standing upright, freshly stitched, the danger in him was even more apparent. Not loud, not showy, but present, like a held breath. "You saved my life tonight." "I did my job." "You did far more than your job. You risked your career, your safety, for a stranger who told you not to call an ambulance and gave you a name that clearly wasn't his." A faint, knowing curve touched his mouth. "You're not a fool, dottoressa. You knew." She lifted her chin. "I knew you were something. I didn't need to know what, to know you'd bleed out if I walked away. That's not bravery. That's just medicine." "No," he said quietly. "That's character. There's a difference, and very few people have it." He reached into his coat again. She tensed, some animal instinct flaring, before she registered it was a card, plain and cream-coloured, with nothing on it but a phone number in elegant script. "If you ever need anything," he said, "call this number. Anything at all." "I don't need anything from you." "Everyone needs something, eventually." He studied her face like he was memorizing it, cataloguing every detail, the dark, tired eyes, the rain-damp curls escaping her braid, the stubborn set of her jaw. "What is your name?" She hesitated, some instinct telling her that giving a man like this her name was handing over more than a word. But she'd already given him her hands, her hours, her clinic's secrecy. What was a name after that? "Ophelia," she said. "Ophelia Rossi." Something shifted behind his eyes, a flicker, gone almost before she registered it, like a name striking a match in a dark room. "Ophelia," he repeated, low, as if tasting it. "A fitting name for a woman who pulls drowning men from the water." Before she could ask what he meant, he was in the car, and the car was gone, tail lights dissolving into the mist, and she stood on the empty street, holding a plain cream card, and the strange, hollow feeling of having just touched something enormous, without understanding its shape. She did not know that night that the man she had saved had funded her music scholarship since she was 17 years old. She did not know his real name was Lorenzo Bianchi, and that half the underworld of the eastern seaboard trembled at the sound of it. She only knew that her hands still smelled of his blood, and that she could not stop thinking about the way he'd said her name, like it already belonged to him. Lorenzo Bianchi did not sleep that night, though the doctor had told him to rest. He sat instead in the study of his penthouse, 40 floors above the wet city, a glass of untouched whiskey sweating a ring onto the mahogany desk, and stared at a manila folder that had sat locked in his private safe for 9 years. He opened it now for the first time in months. Photographs mostly. A girl at 14 with a violin nearly as tall as she was. A scholarship letter with his lawyer's signature instead of his own. A newspaper clipping from a youth conservatory competition with her name circled in his own handwriting. Ophelia Rossi, first prize. He had never planned to meet her. That had been the entire point of the arrangement, a debt paid from a distance, an old promise kept in the dark, where it could not complicate the empire he'd built with blood and patience. Her mother had saved his life once, decades ago, in a way that still woke him at 3 a.m. with his heart hammering. He had paid that debt forward the only way men like him knew how. Money. Silence, distance. And now the daughter of the woman who'd saved him had saved him again, in an alley in the rain, without knowing who he was. He found that he could not stop thinking about her hands, steady even with his blood soaking through them, her voice, sharp as a blade and utterly unafraid, telling him he was an idiot while she worked to keep him alive. In a world of men who flinched from him, women who performed fear or performed desire depending on what they thought he wanted, she had simply seen him, assessed the threat, and decided to help anyway. No one did that. No one had done that in 15 years. The door to his study opened without a knock, the only man alive with that privilege. Dante Bianchi, his younger cousin and the closest thing Lorenzo had to a brother, crossed the room and dropped into the chair opposite the desk, his own face still tight with the leftover adrenaline of the night. "The Morettis are saying it wasn't them," Dante said. "Salvatore swears on his mother's grave he didn't send the knife." Salvatore would swear on Christ's own wounds if it kept a war from his door. Lorenzo closed a folder, sliding it beneath a ledger with the ease of a man accustomed to hiding things in plain sight. "Someone wants me dead, and wants it to look like the Morettis did it. That's more dangerous than the Morettis themselves." "Someone inside?" "Someone who knew my route. Someone who knew I'd be alone outside that alley at that exact hour." Lorenzo's jaw tightened. Only 4 people had known his schedule that night. He did not like where that thought led. "Find out who." Dante nodded, then hesitated, studying his cousin with the particular scrutiny of someone who had known him since they were boys running errands for their uncle in the old neighborhood. "You look different." "I nearly died 2 hours ago." "That's not it." Dante leaned forward. "I've seen you nearly die 4 times, Enzo. You never look like this after. You look—" He stopped, searching for the word, and settled on one that made Lorenzo's jaw flex. "Haunted." Lorenzo said nothing. "Who patched you up?" "A doctor." "You have a doctor?" 3, in fact, all of whom would come at midnight and never ask a question. This one asked several questions, Lorenzo said, and something in his voice, a warmth so foreign Dante actually blinked, made his cousin sit back slowly, reassessing. Madonna, Dante breathed. There's a woman. There's Edette, Lorenzo corrected, too fast. Edette you're thinking about at 3 in the morning with that face. Dante shook his head, half amused, half wary, because he knew better than anyone what obsession looked like on his cousin. Lorenzo did nothing halfway. Not war, not grief, not love, if love was even a word that applied to a man built the way he was. Who is she? Lorenzo looked at the safe where the folder now sat, at the 9 years of silent, unseen devotion contained inside it, and thought of violin calluses on soft hands pressed hard against his bleeding side. No one you need to worry about, he said. It was, perhaps, the first outright lie he had told his cousin in 20 years. Dante, wisely, did not push further, but he left the study troubled, because he had seen his cousin build walls around every soft thing in his life until nothing soft remained, and he recognized, with the particular dread of a man who loved someone dangerous, that something had just cracked one of those walls wide open. Alone again, Lorenzo poured out the whiskey he hadn't touched and dialed a number he hadn't used in months. A private investigator who owed him a debt too large to ever fully repay. I need everything on a woman, he said. Ophelia Rossi, medical student, violinist. I want her schedule, her friends, her family, everything. Discreetly. He paused, staring out at the rain-slicked city, at the small gold dome of the opera house glowing faintly through the mist like a held breath. And find out, he added, quiet and deadly, who put a knife in me outside that building tonight, because whoever it was nearly took her from a debt I haven't finished paying. Ophelia's apartment smelled of rosin and burnt coffee when she got home, exhausted at 4 in the morning, her hands finally scrubbed clean of blood, but her mind still full of winter sea eyes. She had 3 hours before her shift. She used one of them to sit on the edge of her narrow bed and simply breathe, turning the cream card over and over between her fingers before finally tucking it into the drawer of her nightstand, telling herself she would never call it. She was asleep within minutes of her head hitting the pillow, and she dreamed, absurdly, of playing Vivaldi for a man made of shadow. The alarm dragged her up at 7. By 8 she was in scrubs, running on caffeine and adrenaline, suturing a laceration on a construction worker's forearm, while her attending quizzed her on differential diagnoses. By noon, she was exhausted, in the particular way only medical students and new mothers understand. Bone-deep, unglamorous, invisible to anyone who hadn't lived it. By 4, she was standing outside Matteo's school, waiting for the small, dark-haired boy who came barreling out of the doors the second the bell rang, backpack half unzipped, a drawing clutched triumphantly in one fist. "Ophi!" He crashed into her legs with the full-body enthusiasm of a 9-year-old who had not yet learned to be embarrassed by affection. "I got a gold star. Mrs. Hendricks said my drawing was the best one." "Let me see." She crouched to his level, and he thrust the paper at her proudly, a crayon rendering of a knight on a horse, done with more confidence than skill, but she studied it with the reverence he deserved. "This is incredible. Look at that sword." "It's a real sword, not a fake one." He beamed up at her, and for a moment the exhaustion of the last 20 hours simply evaporated. Because this small, fierce boy who had come into her life 4 years ago as a foster placement and never left, was the reason she did any of it. The double majors, the double shifts, the 14-hour days. Somebody had to make sure Matteo never went to bed hungry, never wondered if he'd be sent somewhere else, never felt like an inconvenience the way she once had. She took his hand, and they walked home together through the golden late afternoon light. Matteo chattering about his day with the breathless, unfiltered joy of childhood. And Ophelia let herself simply listen, filing away the ordinary miracle of it. A home-cooked dinner, homework at the kitchen table, a small boy falling asleep against her shoulder during the evening news. It was only after he was in bed, the apartment finally quiet, that her mind returned, helplessly, insistently, to the man in the alley. She had a strange, persistent thought she couldn't shake. She'd seen him before. Not literally, not his face, but something about the cadence of his voice, the particular way he'd said her name like he already knew its weight. It had struck a chord of recognition she couldn't place, the way a melody sometimes surfaces from somewhere you can't remember first hearing it. She thought, too, uneasily, about the money. About how a man like that, a man who travelled with an armed driver, who paid cash in thick, careless stacks, who told a doctor not to call the police after being stabbed, existed in a world so far from the modest one she and Matteo occupied that they might as well have been different planets. And yet... She found the card in her nightstand drawer at 11 that night, turning it over under her reading lamp, tracing the elegant loop of the phone number with one finger. If you ever need anything, call this number. She told herself she was only curious. She told herself a lot of things in the weeks that followed that turned out not to be entirely true. But that first night, staring at a stranger's number in the lamplight, with her little brother asleep down the hall and her own heart beating a rhythm she didn't recognize, she put the card away without calling and told herself that was the end of it. She was wrong. It was only the overture. 3 weeks passed in the ordinary chaos of Ophelia's double life. Rotations, rehearsals, Matteo's soccer games, sleep stolen in 40-minute increments, and she almost convinced herself the man from the alley had been a fever dream, a strange, vivid interruption in an otherwise predictable existence. Then the letter arrived. It came not to her apartment, but to the conservatory, hand-delivered by a courier in an unmarked black car, addressed in the same elegant script as the card, still sitting in her nightstand drawer. Inside, on heavy cream stock, was an invitation to perform a private commission, a solo recital for an anonymous patron's gala, payment enough to cover 2 full semesters of tuition, location, a penthouse address in the city's most exclusive tower. Her first instinct was suspicion. Her second, slower and more honest, was recognition. She called the number on the card before she could talk herself out of it. It rang twice before a voice answered. Not his, a woman's, brisk and professional. Bianchi residence? Ophelia's stomach dropped an inch. Bianchi. She knew that name the way anyone who read the papers knew it, whispered in connection with things the papers never quite proved, a name that made older relatives lower their voices at family dinners. I think there's been a mistake, she said. I'm calling about an invitation, a recital. Miss Rossi? The woman's tone warmed instantly, as if she'd been expecting the call. Mr. Bianchi will be delighted you called. Shall I confirm you for Saturday evening? Ophelia stood very still in the practice room, violin bow dangling forgotten from her hand, and understood, with the particular vertigo of a puzzle piece sliding into place, exactly whose blood had dried under her fingernails 3 weeks ago. Enzo had lied about his name. Enzo was Lorenzo Bianchi. She should have refused, every instinct honed by years of watching Matteo's caseworkers whisper about dangerous men, every headline she'd half read about bodies found in rivers and businesses that burned down suspiciously on schedule. Every rational cell in her body told her to hang up the phone and never think of the number again. She said yes, anyway. She told herself it was the money. She told herself it was professional curiosity, a chance to perform for the kind of private audience that could make a career. She did not let herself examine too closely the small, traitorous thrill that moved through her chest at the thought of seeing those winter sea eyes again. The penthouse, when she arrived Saturday evening in the one formal gown she owned, occupied the entire top floor of a glass tower that seemed to swallow the sky. A silent man in a dark suit escorted her from the elevator through a foyer of marble and low gold light, and she felt immediately like she had stepped into a different world entirely, one where money didn't just buy things, it bent the air around itself. Lorenzo was waiting in the great room, standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows, with his back to her, city lights spread out beneath him like a hand of cards he'd already won. He turned when she entered, and the sight of him, upright, healed, dressed in a black suit that fit him like a second skin, all that dangerous stillness now fully restored, stole the breath clean out of her lungs. "Ophelia," he said, and the sound of her name in his mouth landed exactly the way it had that night in the rain, low and deliberate, like he was claiming something. "You lied to me," she said, before she could stop herself. "Enzo?" His mouth curved, not quite a smile. "I told you a truth wrapped in another name. It happens, in my world, more than you'd like to know." "Your world?" "You saved a man's life without knowing whose life it was. I wanted to keep it that way as long as I could." He crossed the room toward her, unhurried, and she found herself rooted in place, unable to retreat, unable to look away from the way he studied her. Not with the leering assessment she half expected from a man like him, but with something closer to reverence, the way a collector looks at something rare he has finally found. "You are angry with me. I'm careful with men who lie about who they are while bleeding on me." "Fair." He stopped an arm's length away, close enough that she could smell cedar and something darker beneath it, gunmetal and rain. "Then let me be honest now. My name is Lorenzo Bianchi. I run a great deal of this city that the newspapers do not fully understand and would not print if they did. I am dangerous, Ophelia. I will not insult you by pretending otherwise. And yet you invited me into your home. Because you are the only person in 15 years who looked at me and saw a man dying, not a man to be afraid of, or a man to use." His gaze didn't waver. "That is a rare thing. I intend to keep it close." Her pulse thundered in her throat, half fear, half something far more dangerous than fear. "I'm here to play a recital, Mr. Bianchi. Nothing more. Of course, he said, and the way he said it, gentle, indulgent, utterly unconvinced, told her he intended, quite calmly, to make that a lie too. She played for him alone. The gala, it turned out, was a fiction, or rather, a truth deferred. There would be an event, other guests, other ears, but not tonight. Tonight there was only Lorenzo Bianchi, seated in a leather armchair, angled toward the windows, a fire burning low in the hearth, despite the season, and Ophelia standing in the middle of a room larger than her entire apartment, with her violin raised and her heart hammering against her ribs. "I was told this was a commission for a gala," she said, when the silent staff had withdrawn and the enormous room had emptied of everyone but the two of them. "It will be, eventually." Lorenzo did not look apologetic in the slightest. "Tonight I wanted to hear you play without 300 strangers between us. That's presumptuous. I am a presumptuous man." He gestured, almost lazily, toward the windows and the glittering city beyond. "Consider it a private audience for a private savior. You may leave, of course, if you find the arrangement objectionable. My driver will take you home, no charge to your integrity." She should have left. She would tell herself that later, a dozen times, in the quiet hours when she tried to trace the exact moment she'd started falling and couldn't find it. Because it hadn't been one moment. It had been 100 small ones, starting with this, the way he watched her when she lifted the bow, not with lust, but with something far more unsettling, an attention so total it felt like being seen for the first time in her adult life. She played Bach, the chaconne unaccompanied, the piece that had made her weep with frustration for 2 straight years before she finally understood it, the piece that demanded not technical perfection, but naked emotional honesty, 4 minor chords built into a cathedral of grief and defiance. She had performed it 100 times. She had never played it like this. Something about the silence of the room, the weight of his attention, the strange and terrible intimacy of playing for an audience of one dangerous man who had nearly died in her hands 3 weeks ago. It cracked something open in her that she usually kept carefully sealed during performance. She played her mother into the music. The mother she barely remembered, dead before Ophelia turned 6. She played every hospital shift that had left her hollow. Every night she'd lain awake, wondering if she was doing right by Matteo, if she was enough. She played until her arm ached and her eyes burned, and the final chord rang out and died into the vast silence of the room. When she lowered the bow, Lorenzo had not moved. He sat perfectly still, and for a long, unbearable moment he said nothing at all, and she thought, absurdly, that she had somehow failed him, until she saw his jaw working, saw the muscle there flex once, twice, a man fighting some private battle behind an expression trained for 30 years to reveal nothing. "Do you know," he said finally, voice rough in a way she hadn't heard from him yet, "how long it has been since something moved me?" "I don't know anything about you." "No." He rose from the chair, slow and deliberate, and crossed the room toward her the way a man crosses toward something he has decided irrevocably to have. "You don't. And yet you just handed me more of yourself in 4 minutes than anyone has in 15 years. "That's the music, not me." "The music is you, Ophelia. Every choice in it was yours. The tempo, the weight you put on the third movement, the way your hand shook on the final chord because you were feeling something you didn't expect to feel tonight. He stopped close enough that she had to tip her head back to hold his gaze, close enough that the warmth of him reached her through the cool air of the room. "Tell me I'm wrong." She couldn't. That was the terrifying part. She opened her mouth to deny it and found she had no denial in her, only the truth sitting heavy and undeniable in her chest. She had felt something playing for him, some old locked door creaking open on its hinges for the first time in years. "This is a mistake," she said instead, stepping back, putting the violin between them like a shield. "Whatever this is, whatever you think this is." Perhaps. He didn't chase her retreat, didn't crowd her. He simply watched, patient as stone, patient as a man who had learned that the things worth having were worth waiting for. "But I have made a great many mistakes in my life, Ophelia Rossi, and buried men for smaller ones. I find I am not afraid of this one." She left 20 minutes later with an envelope of payment she hadn't earned for a gala that hadn't happened, and the unsettling, undeniable knowledge that something in her chest had shifted permanently off its axis and would not be shifting back. She should have refused the second invitation. She should have refused the third. By the time autumn deepened into the first bite of real cold, Ophelia had played for Lorenzo Bianchi 7 times, twice at genuine galas where she performed for rooms full of men in expensive suits who never quite met her eyes, and 5 times in the private hush of his penthouse for an audience of 1. He never touched her. He never said anything as explicit as "I want you," though the wanting radiated off him so constantly it had become a kind of weather she'd learned to live inside. He simply watched and waited and made himself slowly, unbearably necessary. It was at the second gala that she first saw Camilla Esposito. She was beautiful, in the particular weaponized way of women who had made beauty their entire strategy. Dark hair pinned in an elegant twist, a red gown that seemed poured rather than worn, and a proprietary hand that landed on Lorenzo's forearm the moment Ophelia finished her set, as if staking a claim in front of witnesses. "Lorenzo, caro, you didn't tell me you'd hired entertainment." Her eyes swept over Ophelia with the swift, cataloguing cruelty of a woman assessing competition and deciding, visibly, that there wasn't any. "How quaint." "Camilla." Lorenzo's voice had gone flat, formal, a register Ophelia hadn't heard from him before. The voice, she understood with a small jolt, of a man managing a threat rather than greeting an old friend. "Ophelia Rossi, Camilla Esposito, of the Esposito family." Ophelia understood, in the space of a heartbeat, that this was not merely an ex. The Esposito family. She'd heard the name before, whispered in the same careful undertones as Bianchi, a rival house whose territory bordered Lorenzo's like a fault line that had never quite stopped shaking. "A pleasure," Ophelia said, because there was nothing else to say. "Is it?" Camilla's smile was a blade wearing lipstick. "Lorenzo and I were engaged once. Did he tell you that? Before he decided marrying into my family was more trouble than the alliance was worth." Her gaze cut sideways to him, something old and unhealed flickering there beneath the polish. "He does that. Decides things are more trouble than they're worth. I wonder how long it will take him to decide the same about you." "Enough, Camilla." Lorenzo's hand found the small of Ophelia's back, not possessive exactly, but grounding, a statement made without words. Ophelia is a guest in my home. She is not a subject for your amusement. Of course. Camilla's smile didn't waver, but something in her eyes went cold and calculating in a way that made Ophelia's skin prickle with warning. Enjoy your evening, Dottoressa. I do hope you know what you've wandered into. She glided away into the crowd, and Ophelia let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. An old alliance, Lorenzo said quietly, watching Camilla's retreat with an expression Ophelia couldn't quite read. Not longing, she thought, but something almost like guilt. My father and hers arranged it when I was 19. It ended badly. She has not forgiven me for surviving the ending. She looked at me like she wanted to have me removed from the building, and she would not be wrong to want that. He turned to face her fully, and the possessiveness in his gaze then was undisguised, raw in a way that should have frightened her, and instead sent heat curling low in her stomach. I have never brought another woman to these events, Ophelia. Not once in the years since Camilla. She recognizes what that means, even if you do not yet. And what does it mean? That you are already dangerous to her, he said simply, because you have something she never had. My attention, freely given, not negotiated, not arranged, given. His thumb traced once along her jaw, a touch so light it might have been imagined, except that her whole body lit up in its wake like struck flint. I would advise you to be careful of her. Camilla does not lose gracefully. Ophelia should have walked away that night and never come back, should have recognized the warning wrapped inside his words for what it was, a confession that she had wandered, unknowing, into a war that predated her by years. Instead, she found herself lying awake long after, replaying the ghost weight of his thumb on her jaw, and understanding with dawning, terrified clarity that she was no longer merely intrigued by Lorenzo Bianchi. She was falling, and there was no longer any use pretending otherwise. It happened on a night thick with autumn rain, 3 weeks after the gala, in a moment neither of them planned. Ophelia had come to the penthouse not for a performance, but because Lorenzo had asked, quietly, almost hesitantly, so unlike his usual assured command, if she would simply come to dinner. No violin, no audience, just the two of them, and the strange, fragile thing growing between them that neither had yet named. They ate at a table too large for 2 people, candlelight throwing long shadows across walls hung with art she suspected cost more than the hospital wing she trained in. He asked about her rotations and listened, actually listened, with the same total attention he gave her music, while she talked about the ER, about a child she'd treated that week with a broken arm who'd made her laugh despite the tears, about the particular exhaustion of holding 2 demanding lives at once. Why both? He asked. The medicine and the music. Most people choose one. Because my mother played before she got sick. And because medicine is the thing I'm supposed to do, practical, useful, the kind of career that makes a foster kid employable and stable. She turned her wineglass slowly between her fingers, surprising herself with her own honesty. But the violin is the thing I am. I couldn't give either one up without losing a piece of myself I'm not willing to lose. You don't strike me as a woman who loses pieces of herself easily. I've had practice holding on to things. She looked up, met his gaze across the candlelight. and something passed between them that had nothing to do with words. What about you? Do you have a version of yourself you refuse to lose? His jaw tightened. For a long moment she thought he wouldn't answer. He so rarely gave her anything about himself beyond the polished, dangerous surface. But then he said, quietly, I had a son once. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Had? His mother took him from me 9 years ago, disappeared with him in the night, no explanation, no forwarding address. I searched for 2 years and found nothing but dead ends and a grief I have never fully set down. He stared into the candle flame, and for the first time since the alley, Ophelia saw the full weight of what lived beneath his composure. Not just danger, but loss, an old wound that had never properly healed. I do not speak of this. I am not certain why I am telling you now. Because you trust me, she said softly. Because I have not been able to stop thinking about you since the night you knelt in the rain and told me I was an idiot, he said, low and rough, and rose from his chair and crossed to her side of the table with the slow, deliberate certainty of a man who had made up his mind. I have tried, Ophelia. I have told myself this is madness, that a man in my position cannot afford softness, that you deserve a life without blood on the walls of it. I have failed entirely to talk myself out of you. She stood, too, her heart slamming against her ribs, and found herself close enough to feel the heat of him, close enough to see the storm finally breaking loose behind his winter sea eyes. Lorenzo. Tell me to stop, he said, and I will stop. Tell me this is a mistake, and I will drive you home myself and never invite you back. His hand rose, cupped her jaw with a tenderness that seemed almost violent in a man built the way he was, all coiled danger suddenly gentled into something reverent. But if you do not tell me to stop, I am going to kiss you. And I do not think, after that either of us will be able to pretend this is nothing. She didn't tell him to stop. He kissed her like a man who had been starving and finally allowed himself to eat. Slow at first, almost careful, and then, when she rose onto her toes and fisted her hand in his lapel and kissed him back with everything she'd been holding in for weeks, it turned into something else entirely, something hungry and consuming and utterly without mercy for either of their careful defences. The candlelight guttered, the rain hammered the windows, and somewhere in the wreckage of that kiss, Ophelia Rossi felt every wall she'd built around her own heart come down at once, undefended, and did not, in that moment, care. 3 months slid by, like a current pulling her out to sea, and Ophelia let it, because fighting the pull of Lorenzo Bianchi had become, at some point she could no longer identify, a battle she no longer wanted to win. They were careful, at first. Dinners in private rooms, late nights that ended before dawn so she could be home before Matteo woke. A relationship conducted almost entirely behind closed doors, because Lorenzo was adamant, with a protectiveness that bordered on ferocity, that no one in his world should know her name until he was certain he could keep her safe from it. You don't understand what it means to be seen with me, he told her one night, tracing slow circles on the bare skin of her shoulder as she lay curled against his chest in the vast dark of his bedroom. Every enemy I have would see you as a door into me. I will not open that door until I have no other choice. You make it sound like you're protecting me from a war. I am protecting you from a war, he he said, without a trace of exaggeration, and the seriousness in his voice made her go still. There are men who would take you, hurt you, simply to make me weak. I have buried people for less imagination than that. She should have been terrified. Instead, lying in the dark with his heartbeat steady beneath her ear, she felt something closer to safety than she'd felt in years. The particular, dangerous safety of being wanted by someone powerful enough to actually protect what he claimed. It was on an ordinary Tuesday, 3 weeks later, that the first thread of the truth began to unravel. Matteo had come home from school with a photography assignment, a family tree of all things, meant to teach the 4th grade about heritage, and since Ophelia was the only family he had photographs of, she'd dug an old shoebox out of the closet, sorting through faded pictures of her own parents, her grandmother, the handful of images that survived from Matteo's early childhood before he'd come to live with her. "Who's this?" Matteo asked, holding up a photograph she hadn't looked at in years. Matteo as a toddler, barely 2, sitting on the lap of a dark-haired woman with tired, luminous eyes in front of a small stone church Ophelia didn't recognize. "That's your mother, sweetheart. Isabella." "I don't remember her." Matteo said it matter-of-factly, the way children absorb hard truths without the weight adults would give them. "Do you have any pictures of my dad?" Ophelia hesitated. The caseworker's file, sparse as it was, had listed his father as unknown, a blank space on official paperwork that she'd never had reason to question. "I don't think so, baby. I'm sorry." "That's okay." He shrugged, with the easy resilience of a boy who had built his whole identity around the family he did have, and went back to arranging photographs on his poster board. And Ophelia thought nothing more of it, until, 3 days later, sitting on Lorenzo's sofa, waiting for him to finish a call in his study, her eyes fell on a small, silver-framed photograph on the side table that she'd walked past a dozen times without truly looking at. A woman with dark, tired, luminous eyes. A small stone church in the background. Her stomach dropped through the floor. She was still staring at the photograph, heart hammering, when Lorenzo emerged from his study, his expression shifting instantly from businesslike to concerned at whatever he saw on her face. "Ophelia? What's wrong?" "Who is this?" She held up the frame, hand trembling. "This woman. Who is she?" Something in his face closed like a door slamming. "Where did you see that photograph before?" "Answer my question first." Her voice came out sharper than she intended, fear sharpening into something close to panic. "Who is she, Lorenzo?" He was silent for a long moment, and in that silence she watched the composed, dangerous man she'd fallen for disappear entirely, replaced by something raw and stripped bare. "Her name was Isabella," he said finally, quietly, like each word cost him something. "She was the mother of my son. The woman who disappeared with him 9 years ago and never let me find them again." The room seemed to tilt around her. "Isabella," Ophelia repeated, the name suddenly a stone in her throat. "Isabella what?" "Marchetti." Lorenzo's eyes narrowed, reading the horror dawning on her face with the particular sharpness of a man who had spent his whole life learning to see danger before it arrived. "Ophelia, why are you asking me this?" She thought of a 9-year-old boy with a drawing of a knight, a small stone church, a mother he'd never known. "Because," she whispered, the words scraping her raw on the way out, "I think I've been raising your son For a full minute, Lorenzo Bianchi, a man who had faced down rival dons, survived 3 assassination attempts, buried men who had betrayed him without a flicker of hesitation, said absolutely nothing at all. "Say that again," he said finally, his voice gone unnervingly quiet. "Matteo." Ophelia's hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs to still them. "My little brother. My foster brother. I adopted him 3 years ago. He was placed with me when he was 6 after his mother died, and there was no other family listed. His mother's name was Isabella. I have a photograph of her in front of a stone church that is identical to the one sitting on your side table." "Isabella is dead?" The question came out of him like something torn loose, all his composure stripped away at once. "She died when Matteo was 6. An aneurysm, according to the file. He doesn't remember much about her." Ophelia's throat closed around the next words. "Lorenzo, I need to see a photograph of you, from when you were young. I need to know if—" He was already moving, crossing to the study and returning with another photograph. This one older, worn at the edges. A young man in his 20s with dark hair and eyes the colour of a winter sea, standing beside a woman who was unmistakably the same tired, luminous-eyed woman from Ophelia's shoebox. Ophelia's knees nearly gave out. "Oh my God," she whispered. "He has your eyes. I've looked at those eyes every single day for 4 years, and I never— How could I not have?" She pressed a hand over her mouth. Horror and disbelief, and something that felt disturbingly like joy, crashing through her all at once. "Matteo is your son." Lorenzo sank into the nearest chair, as though his legs had simply stopped working, the photograph still clutched in one hand. And for the first time since she'd met him, Ophelia watched Lorenzo Bianchi come apart at the seams, not loudly, not with the violence she might have expected from a man of his world, but quietly, devastatingly, tears he did not bother to hide, tracking silently down a face carved from 30 years of practiced control. "9 years," he said hoarsely. 9 years I searched for them. I hired every investigator, called in every debt, turned over half this city looking for my son, and he was 3 miles from this apartment the entire time, being raised by—" He looked up at her, and the expression on his face was so raw, so unguarded, that she felt it like a physical blow. "By you. He was raised by you." "I didn't know." Ophelia's own tears had started now, hot and fast. "Lorenzo, I swear to you, I had no idea. The file said his father was unknown. There was nothing—" "I believe you." He said it instantly, without a shred of doubt, rising and crossing to her in 3 long strides and pulling her into arms that trembled with the force of everything he was feeling. "I believe you, amore. This was never your doing. This was Isabella's." Something dark moved across his face then, grief curdling into something colder. "She hid him from me. She let me believe for 9 years that I had lost him to the world, when all along she simply hid him 3 miles away and let him grow up believing he had no father at all." "Why would she do that?" Lorenzo was quiet for a long moment, staring past her at nothing, at some old memory Ophelia couldn't see. "Because of who I am," he said finally. "Because when she left, my family was in the middle of the worst war we have ever fought. A war for control of the entire Eastern Territory. 3 families bleeding each other in the streets for 2 straight years. She was afraid, and she was right to be afraid. A son of mine, known, would have been a target every day of his life. Every enemy I have ever made would have used him against me without hesitation. And now? Now the war is quieter, but it is not over. His hands tightened on her shoulders, and the fear that moved through his eyes then was unlike anything she'd seen in him before. Not fear for himself, she understood, but fear for a 9-year-old boy who had no idea what he'd just become. Ophelia, listen to me carefully. The moment anyone learns that Matteo is my son, the Morettis, the Espositos, any of a dozen men who would love nothing more than to see me broken, his life will never be safe again. Yours will never be safe again. He's already my life, she said fiercely, wiping at her tears with the back of her hand, something protective and immovable rising up in her chest. He was my life before I ever knew who you were. Nothing about that changes now. Lorenzo looked at her. This woman who had knelt in the rain to save a stranger, who had unknowingly raised his son with more love and stability than his own dangerous world could have offered, who was now standing in his study with tears on her face, telling him she would fight for that boy with everything she had. And something in his chest broke open entirely, all the careful walls of 15 years crumbling at once. "I love you," he said, the words raw and unpracticed, a confession he had clearly never expected to make to anyone. "I did not intend to. I have spent my entire adult life making certain I loved nothing that could be used against me. And then you knelt down in an alley in the rain and undid all of it in 4 minutes." He cupped her face in both hands, forcing her to hold his gaze. "I love you, and I love that boy already, though I have not even held him yet, and I swear to you on everything I have ever built, I will burn this entire city to the ground before I let anyone touch either of you." They did not tell Matteo the truth that week or the next. Lorenzo insisted on it with an intensity that brooked no argument, not out of secrecy for its own sake, but out of a fierce, almost desperate need to build a foundation first, to become a presence in his son's life before he became a revelation. "Let him know me as someone before he has to process what I am," Lorenzo said, sitting across from Ophelia at her small kitchen table in her small apartment, looking entirely out of place among the second-hand furniture, and yet somehow impossibly at home. "Please, Ophelia, I am asking you to trust me with something I have never had the chance to be trusted with." So they introduced him, slowly, carefully, a friend of Ophelia's, a tall, quiet man who started appearing at Matteo's soccer games on Saturday mornings, standing at the edge of the field in a suit that made the other parents whisper, watching his son with an intensity that made Ophelia's chest ache every single time. Matteo, with the uncomplicated openness of a 9-year-old who had never learned to be suspicious of kindness, adored him almost instantly. Lorenzo, it turned out, knew an alarming amount about medieval knights and dinosaurs and the exact right way to throw a baseball. And within 3 weeks, Matteo was asking with heartbreaking regularity when Enzo was coming over next. "He's good with him," Ophelia said one evening, watching from the kitchen window as Lorenzo, jacket discarded, sleeves rolled up, tie long abandoned, chased Matteo around the small backyard in an increasingly elaborate game involving imaginary dragons. "I didn't expect that." "Why not?" Dante asked from beside her. He'd come to help set up for dinner, had become, in the strange new configuration of her life, something like family himself. He's wanted a son his whole life. He just never let himself believe he'd get to have one again. Does everyone in your family know now? Dante's expression sobered. The people who need to know. The people who don't. He hesitated, watching his cousin scoop a shrieking, delighted Matteo up onto his shoulders. The fewer who know, the safer that boy stays. You understand that, don't you? You've seen how careful he is. I understand it, Ophelia said quietly. I just wish understanding it made it feel less like living with a countdown clock. It was 3 weeks after that conversation, on a Sunday afternoon thick with the smell of Lorenzo's attempt at homemade sauce, a disaster he'd insisted on making himself over Ophelia's protests, because a father should be able to cook for his son, that Matteo finally asked the question that had clearly been building in him for weeks. Are you my dad? The kitchen went completely silent. Lorenzo set down the wooden spoon very carefully, and Ophelia watched him kneel to Matteo's level with a gentleness that made her throat close. What makes you ask that? He said softly. You have the same eyes as me, in the mirror. Matteo's small face was serious in the way children's faces get when they're working through something enormous. And you're always here. And you look at me like, he struggled for the words, like Ophi looks at me, like you already love me, even though we just met. Lorenzo was quiet for a long moment, and Ophelia saw him glance up at her, asking permission, she understood, though this was his truth to give as much as hers. She nodded. Yes, Lorenzo said, his voice rough with an emotion he made no attempt to hide. I am your father, Matteo. Your mother, she had reasons, good reasons, for keeping that from you. Reasons I understand, even though they broke my heart. But I have been looking for you for a very long time, and I am so glad I found you. Matteo studied him with the frank, unblinking assessment only children are capable of. Are you going to take me away from Ophi? Never, Lorenzo said instantly, fiercely, pulling the boy into an embrace that Ophelia watched with tears sliding freely down her face. Never, figlio mio. She saved my life once, and then she saved yours 1,000 times over, every single day for 4 years, and I would sooner burn down the whole world than take you from the person who did that for you. We are a family now, all 3 of us. That is the only part that is going to change. Matteo, with the boundless resilience of childhood, seemed to accept this with remarkable ease, asked a few more questions about knights and dragons, demanded to know if his father knew how to make pasta from scratch. He did not, as evidenced by the smoking pot on the stove, and within the hour was back to being simply, gloriously 9 years old, chattering about school and soccer, and whether dinosaurs could have survived if they'd had better teamwork. But Ophelia, watching Lorenzo hold his son for the first time, with the desperate tenderness of a man who had spent 9 years grieving a loss that had never actually happened, understood that something fundamental had shifted in all their lives. A family assembled out of grief and secrecy and impossible coincidence, fragile and precious, and, she feared, already a target. She did not yet know how right that fear would prove to be. The nausea started on a Tuesday, sharp and sudden, in the middle of a differential diagnosis lecture, sending Ophelia sprinting for the nearest bathroom with a speed that drew concerned looks from her classmates. She told herself it was stress. She told herself it was the flu circulating through the hospital. The exhaustion of running two lives, and now a third, unofficial one, as a mother, in all but name, to a boy who was slowly, joyfully, coming to understand he had a father. She told herself a great many things over the following week, right up until the morning she stood in her own bathroom with a pregnancy test in her shaking hand and watched two pink lines resolve with merciless clarity. She sat down hard on the edge of the bathtub and did not move for 20 minutes. It wasn't that she didn't want children. Some quiet, unguarded part of her, watching Lorenzo with Matteo these past weeks, had already begun to imagine it, a future she'd never let herself picture before. It was the timing. It was the danger. It was the sudden, vertiginous understanding that she was no longer merely dating a man from a violent world or raising his secret son. She was now carrying his child, in a life where being his family had already been declared, by his own mouth, a liability that could be exploited by men who would burn the world down to hurt him. She didn't tell him for 4 days. She told him, in the end, on a rainy evening not unlike the one where they'd met, sitting across from him at the same table where he'd first confessed to loving her, and she watched every trace of colour drain from his face when she said the words. "Pregnant," he repeated, as if testing whether the word would hold weight if he said it aloud. "You're certain?" 3 tests, and I saw an OB yesterday, just to be sure. Her hands were laced tightly together in her lap. "I'm 8 weeks along, Lorenzo." He was silent for so long that fear began to curl through her chest, fear that she'd misjudged everything, that a man like this, already stretched between an empire and a newly discovered son, would see this as one burden too many. Then he rose from his chair, crossed to her side of the table, and sank to his knees in front of her, a position she had never once imagined a man like Lorenzo Bianchi occupying, and pressed his forehead against her still, flat stomach with a reverence that stole the breath from her lungs. "A child," he said, voice breaking on the word. "Our child." He looked up at her, and his eyes were wet, and for a moment the terrifying kingpin disappeared entirely, replaced by a man overwhelmed by a joy he had clearly never expected to feel twice in one lifetime. "Ophelia, do you understand what you have given me? First Matteo, and now this. I did not know it was possible to be given back this much of a life I thought I'd lost forever. I'm scared," she admitted, her voice cracking. "Not of the baby, of everything around the baby. If Matteo being your son is dangerous, what does that make this child? What does that make me?" His expression sobered instantly, the joy tempered by the same fierce protectiveness she'd come to recognize as fundamental to who he was. "It makes you the most precious thing in my entire world," he said, rising to sit beside her, gathering her hands in both of his. "And it means I am done being careful about hiding what I feel for you. I have spent months keeping you separate from my world to protect you, and all it has done is leave you unguarded when the truth finally surfaces, as truths like this always do." His jaw set, resolve hardening behind his eyes. "It is time the entire city knows that Ophelia Rossi belongs to me, and that anyone who threatens her, or my son, or this child, will answer to me personally." "That sounds less like protection and more like painting a target on my back." "No." He lifted her hand, pressed a kiss to her knuckles with a tenderness that contradicted the steel in his voice. It means every man who might have considered you a weakness to exploit will understand very clearly that touching you means declaring war on the most dangerous man in this city. Fear is a kind of armor, amore. I intend to wrap you and our children in every layer of it that I have. She wanted to believe him. Lying awake that night with his hand splayed protectively over her still flat stomach, his breathing slow and even against her hair, she wanted desperately to believe that his power could hold back whatever storm was coming. She did not yet know that the storm had already begun to gather, that somewhere across the city, in a mansion with a shrine to an old grudge and a decade of accumulated hatred, Camilla Esposito had already learned about Matteo and was, at that very moment, deciding exactly how to use him. Camilla Esposito had not survived 34 years in a world built to destroy women like her by acting on impulse. She had survived by patience, by watching, by understanding that the deepest wounds are the ones delivered slowly, with precision, at the exact moment the victim has finally let their guard down. She had suspected, for months, that something had changed in Lorenzo, the way he'd stopped attending certain events, the rumours of a violinist who visited his penthouse with increasing frequency, the strange softness that had crept into a man she'd once loved and never forgiven for choosing his empire over her. She had assumed initially it was simply a mistress, a passing indulgence that would burn itself out the way all his previous indulgences had. Then her own investigator, a woman with expensive tastes and questionable loyalties, easily bought, had returned with something far more interesting than an affair. A boy. 9 years old, living with the violinist under a different surname, adopted through the foster system 3 years prior, mother deceased, father listed as unknown on every official document, except that the boy's photograph, when Camilla studied it under lamplight with a magnifying glass and a decade of accumulated bitterness, bore Lorenzo Bianchi's eyes with a clarity that made her hands shake with something between triumph and rage. Isabella's boy. She remembered Isabella Marchetti vaguely from years ago, a quiet woman who had disappeared from the periphery of Lorenzo's life around the same time the territorial war had reached its bloodiest peak. Camilla had assumed, along with everyone else, that Isabella had simply fled the violence. She had never imagined the woman had been carrying Lorenzo's child. She sat with the information for 2 full weeks, turning it over like a jewel, deciding how best to cut it. She could have gone to Lorenzo directly, could have used the knowledge as leverage in some negotiation for territory or alliance. But that would have satisfied only the strategic part of her. And Camilla, whatever else she had become, had never fully buried the part of her that still burned, after all these years, at the memory of Lorenzo choosing his empire over their engagement, choosing distance over her, choosing, in the end, everyone but her. She wanted him to feel something. She wanted him to understand, in his gut, the particular terror of loving something you cannot fully protect. So she went instead to Salvatore Moretti. The Morettis and the Espositos had never been natural allies. Old grudges of their own simmered beneath any cooperation. But Salvatore had wanted Lorenzo Bianchi dead or broken for 3 years running, ever since Lorenzo's territory expansion had cost the Morettis their most profitable ports, and Camilla understood, with the cold clarity of someone who had learned to weaponize other people's hatred, that Salvatore would pay handsomely and act ruthlessly for exactly the kind of leverage she now possessed. A son, Salvatore repeated when she'd finished, his heavy face creasing into a slow, delighted smile that made her skin crawl even as she savoured what it meant. Lorenzo Bianchi has a son, and no one knows. Madonna. This is a gift, Camilla. This is the gift of a lifetime. I want something for it, she said, because even betrayal in her world had a price. Name it. When this is over, when Lorenzo is broken, when his empire is carved up and redistributed, I want the Eastern Docks, and I want to be the one who tells him, personally, exactly what I did and why. Something dark and hungry moved behind her eyes. I want him to know, before the end, that I am the reason he lost everything. Salvatore studied her for a long moment, some flicker of wariness crossing his broad face. The recognition, perhaps, that a woman capable of this kind of patient cruelty was not a woman to be fully trusted, even as an ally. But greed, in the end, outweighed caution, as it so often did in men like him. Done, he said, extending a hand thick with rings. We take the boy, we take the doctor if it comes to that, and Lorenzo Bianchi finally learns what it costs to make an enemy of the Esposito family. Camilla shook his hand, and if her smile held more grief than triumph in that moment, a decade-old wound finally brutally repaid, she did not let it show. Across the city, entirely unaware, Lorenzo Bianchi sat beside Ophelia on the terrace of his penthouse, one hand resting over the small, still flat curve of her stomach, watching Matteo chase fireflies across the lawn below in the last gold light of an ordinary summer evening, and allowed himself, for the first time in 15 years, to believe that he had finally built something the world could not take from him. He was wrong, and the war that would prove it was already, quietly, beginning to move. The first sign came on a Thursday, subtle enough that Ophelia almost missed it. A black sedan parked across the street from Matteo's school for 3 consecutive afternoons, engine idling, windows tinted too dark to see through. She mentioned it to Lorenzo almost in passing over dinner, expecting reassurance. Instead, his face went utterly still in the way she'd learned meant real, immediate danger. Describe it, he said, already reaching for his phone. Black sedan, tinted windows, parked near the crosswalk. I only noticed because it was there every day this week at exactly the same time. Fear coiled tight in her chest at the speed with which his entire demeanour had shifted. Lorenzo, what is it? It is surveillance, he said grimly, already dialing. Someone is watching the school, watching him. He spoke rapid, low Italian into the phone. Instructions, she gathered, for security to be doubled immediately, for the plate number to be traced, for every entrance and exit at Matteo's school to be monitored around the clock. And when he hung up, his jaw was set with a fury she had only glimpsed once before, the night she'd found the photograph. You think someone found out about him? She said. I think, he said carefully, that we have been too visible for too long, and someone has connected pieces I hoped would stay separate. He crossed the room, pulling her into his arms with a fierceness that spoke to a fear he was working hard not to voice aloud. I am moving you and Matteo into the penthouse, effective tonight. No arguments, Ophelia. I have spent 9 years learning what it costs to be too slow reacting to a threat against him, and I will not make that mistake twice. She didn't argue. She packed a bag that night with hands that wouldn't quite stop trembling, sat Matteo down and told him, in the gentlest terms she could manage, that they were going to stay somewhere new for a while. An adventure, she called it, though her voice shook enough that even a 9-year-old could sense the lie beneath the reassurance. By midnight, they were installed in the penthouse under a security detail that would have looked, to any outside observer, like a small private army. Men positioned at every entrance, cameras monitoring every angle of the building, Dante himself taking up residence in the guest suite down the hall, armed and grim-faced, a constant watchful presence.
"How bad is this?" Ophelia asked Lorenzo that night, once Matteo was finally asleep in an unfamiliar bed, once the apartment had gone quiet around them. "I don't know yet." He stood at the window, staring down at the city with an expression she'd never seen on him before. Not the cold calculation of a man managing an enemy, but something rawer, closer to fear. My investigator traced the plate to a shell company. It leads back, eventually, to Salvatore Moretti. But the pattern of the surveillance, the timing, it doesn't feel like Moretti's usual methods. Moretti is direct, brutal. He doesn't watch and wait. He strikes. He turned to face her, and the fear in his eyes made her stomach drop. "This feels like someone else's patience, wearing Moretti's face." "Who?" "I don't know yet," he admitted, and the admission cost him visibly, a man unaccustomed to not having every answer. "But I intend to find out before they make whatever move they're planning." He didn't sleep that night. Ophelia woke twice to find him still standing at the window, phone pressed to his ear, voice low and urgent, coordinating with a network of men she'd never met to trace a threat that remained, infuriatingly, just out of reach. It was 2 days later, in the middle of a Wednesday afternoon, that the threat stopped being abstract. Ophelia was in the penthouse kitchen when her phone rang. Matteo's school, the principal's office, a voice tight with barely controlled panic, explaining that Matteo had never arrived for afternoon pickup, that the substitute teacher covering recess had lost sight of him for less than 5 minutes near the far fence line, that security footage showed a van, no plates visible, and a small boy who had simply vanished. The phone slipped from her hand and shattered on the marble floor, and the sound that came out of her then was not a word at all, just a raw, animal cry of a mother whose child had just been taken from the world. And somewhere across the penthouse, she heard Lorenzo's chair crash backward as he rose so fast it fell, already moving, already becoming, in the space of a single, terrible heartbeat, the most dangerous version of himself the city had ever seen. What followed was not chaos. It was, in its own terrible way, the most organized thing Ophelia had ever witnessed. Lorenzo Bianchi transforming before her eyes from the tender, careful man who chased fireflies with his son into something forged entirely of purpose and fury. Every ounce of grief channeled instantly into cold, methodical action. Within 10 minutes, his entire network was mobilized. Dante was on 3 phones simultaneously, coordinating a search grid across the city's docks, warehouses, and known Esposito and Moretti properties. Men Ophelia had never seen before materialized in the penthouse within the hour. Soldiers, she understood now. An army she'd never fully registered existed beneath the polished veneer of galas and penthouse dinners. "I need you to stay here," Lorenzo told her, gripping her shoulders, his eyes blazing with a controlled violence that should have frightened her, and instead
in that moment, felt like the only solid ground in a world that had just fallen away beneath her. I know what I am asking. I know it is the hardest thing I have ever asked you to do. But you are pregnant, and you are the only parent that boy has left standing free, and I cannot protect all three of you if you are out there too. I can't just sit here while my son is— Our son, he corrected, fierce and immediate. And I swear to you on my life, on this child you are carrying, I will bring him home. His hands cupped her face, forcing her to hold his gaze through the tears streaming down her cheeks. I have spent my entire existence building the kind of power that can move mountains when it needs to. Let me use it. Let me be what I am, for him, one last time. She nodded, because there was nothing else to do, and watched him leave with a small army at his back, and spent the following hours in a state of suspended terror she had no medical vocabulary adequate to describe. The ransom call came at 7 that evening. Lorenzo took it on speaker in the penthouse study, Ophelia gripping the edge of the desk hard enough to whiten her knuckles, as a voice she didn't recognize, flat, businesslike, utterly devoid of the mercy she was praying for, laid out terms. "The boy is safe," the voice said. "For now. You have until midnight to agree to our terms, or that changes."
"What terms?" Lorenzo said, his voice a study in lethal calm that Ophelia understood, watching him, was costing him everything to maintain. "The eastern docks, the shipping routes through the harbour, full and permanent transfer of control to the Moretti family, signed, witnessed, and irreversible." A pause, deliberate, designed to twist the knife. "And a personal message, from someone who wanted you to know exactly who orchestrated your downfall. Camilla sends her regards, Lorenzo. She wanted you to understand that some debts don't stay buried." The line went dead. Lorenzo stood frozen for a long moment, and Ophelia watched something break and reform behind his eyes almost simultaneously. Grief, fury, and a dawning, terrible clarity, all crashing together at once. "Camilla," he said, low and disbelieving. "She found out about Matteo. She went to Salvatore." His hands curled into fists at his sides. "This isn't a territorial move. This is revenge. 15-year-old, festering revenge, and she used my son to deliver it." "They want the docks," Ophelia said, forcing herself to focus on the practical, because if she let herself feel the full weight of what was happening, she would shatter entirely. "Will you give them the docks?" "I will give them the entire ocean, if it brings him home safely." Lorenzo's jaw tightened. But men like Salvatore Moretti do not release hostages simply because they receive what they asked for. He will keep Matteo as leverage regardless of what I sign, because a boy in his possession is worth more to him than any shipping route. His gaze sharpened, the grief giving way visibly to strategy. "Which means signing is not the answer. Finding him before midnight is." Dante appeared in the doorway, breathless, a tablet in hand. "We have something. A warehouse on the old fishing pier, registered to a shell company that traces back through 4 layers to a Moretti holding. It's not confirmed, but it's the strongest lead we have. And the timeline fits. The van was tracked to within 6 blocks of it before we lost the feed." Lorenzo was already reaching for the gun holstered beneath his jacket, the same coiled, lethal stillness Ophelia had first witnessed in an alley in the rain,
now aimed entirely, terrifyingly, at getting his son back. "Assemble, everyone," he said. "We move in 20 minutes." He turned to Ophelia one final time before he left, and the look he gave her, desperate, fierce, full of a love too large for words, burned itself into her memory with a permanence she knew she would carry for the rest of her life. "I will bring him home," he said. "I swear it on everything I have ever built, on this child, on you. I will bring our son home." And then he was gone, into the dark, dangerous city he ruled, to wage the only war he had ever cared about winning. Ophelia did not stay in the penthouse. She told herself, pacing the empty rooms in the hour after Lorenzo left, that she would honour his request, that pregnancy and helplessness gave her no other reasonable choice. And then she thought of Matteo's face, of his small hand in hers on 100 ordinary mornings, of the promise she had made herself the day he'd first come to live with her, that she would never, under any circumstances, let him believe himself unwanted or unprotected. And she understood, with a certainty that overrode every rational argument, that she could not simply wait. She called Marisol. Her old mentor arrived within 20 minutes, grim-faced, medical bag in hand, understanding without needing to be told twice that a doctor's presence would be needed wherever this night ended. And together they followed the trail of Lorenzo's convoy at a careful distance, Marisol driving, while Ophelia tracked the location Dante had reluctantly texted her. A fishing pier on the city's industrial edge, warehouses looming black against a sky bruised purple with the last light of evening. They arrived to a scene already unfolding into violence. Gunfire cracked in short, controlled bursts from somewhere inside the largest warehouse, muzzle flashes strobing against grimy windows. Lorenzo's men had the building surrounded, a tightening noose of dark-suited figures moving with the disciplined precision of soldiers who had done this before. And Ophelia watched, heart in her throat, as Lorenzo himself, no longer the composed penthouse lover, but something ancient and terrible, a king reclaiming his territory, led the breach through the warehouse's side entrance with Dante at his shoulder. She should have stayed in the car. She told herself that, even as she was already moving, Marisol's hand closing hard around her wrist in protest, and she shook it off with a desperation that surprised even herself, running low across the gravel lot toward the sound of her son's name being screamed from somewhere inside that terrible building. Inside, the warehouse was chaos given shape. Crates stacked in towering rows, dim emergency lighting throwing everything into stark, moving shadow, the smell of gun smoke thick enough to taste. She found Matteo before she found Lorenzo, huddled behind an overturned pallet where one of the guards, a young man with kind eyes and a Moretti tattoo he'd clearly regretted the moment the shooting started, had shoved him for protection rather than harm, some flicker of conscience surviving even in that terrible place. "Ophi!" Matteo's voice cracked on a sob of pure relief, and she was across the distance in seconds, gathering him into her arms with a force that would have hurt if either of them had cared, sheltering his small body with her own as gunfire continued to echo somewhere beyond the crates. "I've got you, baby. I've got you. You're safe now," she chanted into his hair, tears streaming freely down her face, and for one perfect, suspended moment, nothing else in the world existed except the solid, living weight of him in her arms. Then Salvatore Moretti stepped out from behind a stack of crates 20 feet away, gun raised, his broad face twisted with the particular desperation of a man who understood his plan had already collapsed and had nothing left to lose. "Move away from the boy," he said, voice rough with adrenaline and fury. "Move away, or I put a bullet through both of you and take my chances with Lorenzo's men after." Ophelia froze, curling her body instinctively around Matteo, some primal calculation running through her mind at lightning speed. The angle, the distance, whether she could shield him fully with her own body, whether the child she was carrying would survive if she took a bullet meant for both her son and herself. "Salvatore!" Lorenzo's voice cut through the warehouse like a blade, and Ophelia's head whipped toward the sound, to find him standing not 15 feet away, gun levelled with a steadiness that belied the murder written plainly across his face. "You want to shoot someone tonight, you shoot me. Not a woman carrying my child. Not my son. Me." "You took everything from my family," Salvatore snarled, gun wavering between Lorenzo and the small, huddled shape of Ophelia and Matteo. "The ports, the territory, 3 of my best men dead in the process. You think I'm walking away with nothing? You're walking away with your life, if you're smart enough to take the offer," Lorenzo said, voice gone deadly quiet. "That's more mercy than you deserve, and considerably more than you'll get if you make me choose between negotiation and burying you where you stand." For one endless, terrible heartbeat, no one moved. Ophelia held her breath, Matteo trembling silently against her chest, and watched Salvatore Moretti's finger tighten fractionally on the trigger, watched Lorenzo's entire body coil in response, and understood that the next half-second would determine whether her family survived this night whole or shattered beyond repair. The shot, when it came, did not come from Salvatore's gun. It came from behind him, a single, precise crack that sent him crumpling forward, the weapon clattering from his grip as he collapsed against the crates and slid boneless to the concrete floor. Dante lowered his own weapon, expression grim, having crossed the warehouse in the chaos and positioned himself exactly where he needed to be the instant his cousin's family was threatened. "Clear!" Dante's voice rang out across the sudden, ringing silence, and within seconds Lorenzo's men flooded the space, securing the remaining Moretti soldiers who threw down their weapons at the sight of their boss bleeding out on the floor, the fight gone out of them entirely. Lorenzo crossed the distance to Ophelia and Matteo in 3 long strides and dropped to his knees before them, gathering them both into an embrace so fierce it stole the breath from Ophelia's lungs, his whole body shaking with the aftermath of terror, finally allowed release. "You're safe," he kept saying, into Matteo's hair, into Ophelia's, over and over, like a man reassuring himself the words were true. "You're both safe, Dio. You're safe." "I'm sorry," Ophelia gasped, tears and relief tangled together in her voice. "I couldn't stay away. I couldn't just wait while—" "Don't." He pulled back just enough to cup her face, his own eyes wet, his composure entirely, gloriously abandoned. "Don't apologize for loving him enough to run into a warehouse full of gunfire." "I have never," his voice broke, "I have never loved anyone the way I love the 2 of you. The 3 of you," he corrected, one hand dropping briefly, reverently, to the still flat curve of her stomach. Marisol arrived moments later, breathless from the run across the lot, and immediately began checking Matteo over with brisk, efficient hands, bruised, frightened, but physically unharmed. The relief of that diagnosis nearly buckling Ophelia's knees entirely. It was only later, in the wreckage of the aftermath, that the second half of the night's truth arrived. Camilla Esposito was waiting for them outside the warehouse, standing beside a black car with two of her own men flanking her, her expression a strange, terrible mixture of triumph and grief that made Ophelia's skin crawl the moment she saw it.
"You survived," Camilla said to Lorenzo, voice flat.
"Of course you did. You always survive, Lorenzo. It's the people around you who pay the price." "You used my son," Lorenzo said, and the fury in his voice was a living thing, barely contained. "A child, Camilla. You handed a 9-year-old boy to Salvatore Moretti to satisfy a 15-year-old grudge. I gave you the chance to feel, for one night, what it was like to be helpless." Her composure cracked, finally, revealing the raw wound beneath 15 years of practiced cruelty. "Do you know what it felt like? Watching you choose your empire over me, over and over, for years? Do you know what it felt like when you finally let yourself love someone, and it wasn't me? That does not excuse what you did tonight."
"No," she said quietly, something breaking behind her eyes. "It doesn't. I know that."
She looked past him to where Ophelia stood cradling Matteo against her side, and something in her expression shifted. Not quite remorse, but something adjacent to it, the recognition of a line crossed that could never be uncrossed. "For what it's worth, I never intended for the boy to actually be harmed. I told Salvatore to keep him safe. I wanted you broken, Lorenzo, not a child's blood on my hands." "That distinction means very little to a 9-year-old who was kidnapped from his school," Ophelia said, stepping forward despite Lorenzo's hand tightening protectively on her arm, her voice shaking with an anger she'd never fully accessed before in her life.
"You don't get absolution for good intentions when you handed my son to armed men."
Camilla studied her for a long moment, something like respect flickering behind the ruin of her expression. "No," she agreed. "I suppose I don't." Police sirens rose in the distance. Lorenzo's men, Ophelia understood, had already begun the careful, practiced work of managing the scene, of ensuring the story that emerged would protect the family rather than expose it. And Camilla, watching the lights approach, seemed to accept with a strange and sudden calm that her war had finally, irrevocably ended. "I'll disappear," she said quietly. "Leave the city. It's the only offer I have left to make." She looked at Lorenzo one final time, old grief and older love tangled together in her gaze. "I hope you're happy, Lorenzo. I hope it was worth what it cost all of us." She was gone before the sirens arrived, into the dark, and Lorenzo stood watching the empty space where she'd been with an expression Ophelia couldn't fully read. Relief and grief, and the particular exhaustion of a man who had just watched an old chapter of his life close, permanently, in fire. The weeks that followed unfolded in the strange, suspended quiet that comes after violence. The careful work of rebuilding an ordinary life around the edges of an extraordinary trauma. Matteo had nightmares at first. He would wake screaming some nights, certain the van had come back for him, and Ophelia and Lorenzo took turns sitting with him in the dark, holding him reminding him with quiet, patient repetition that he was safe. That his father's men now watched over his school with a discretion that kept him from ever feeling like a prisoner, even as it kept him thoroughly protected. A child therapist, gentle and unhurried, became a weekly fixture in his life, and slowly, over the course of 2 months, the nightmares began to loosen their grip, replaced gradually by the ordinary resilience of childhood reasserting itself. Salvatore Moretti, gravely wounded but alive, faced a reckoning of his own. Not through the police, whose involvement Lorenzo had managed to minimize through channels Ophelia didn't ask too many questions about, but through the underworld's own brutal calculus. The Moretti family's territory was carved up within a month, distributed among rival houses eager to capitalize on his weakness, his own organization fracturing under the weight of a failed, exposed play against a man too powerful and too furious to forgive. Whatever remained of Salvatore's influence in the city withered within the season. Camilla Esposito was never seen again. Whether she had fled the country, as she'd promised, or met a quieter, more permanent fate at the hands of her own family for the catastrophic failure of her scheme, Lorenzo never told Ophelia, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she didn't want to know. Some doors were better left closed. "Do you regret loving her?" Ophelia asked him one evening, months later, as they sat together on the penthouse terrace, watching Matteo do cannonballs into the newly installed pool below, his laughter ringing bright and unburdened across the summer air. Lorenzo considered the question seriously, the way he considered everything she asked him now, with a thoughtfulness that still, after all these months, sometimes caught her off guard. "I regret what loving her cost, in the end. I do not regret the person I was before her, or the lessons her betrayal taught me about the difference between arrangement and choice." He turned to look at Ophelia, and the warmth in his gaze had lost none of its intensity in the months since the warehouse. If anything, it had deepened, settled into something steadier and more permanent. "I chose you, Ophelia. Every single day since the rain, I have chosen you. That is a different thing entirely from what I had with Camilla, and I think some part of her understood that, even as she tried to destroy it." "Do you think she'll come back?" No. His certainty was absolute. Whatever else Camilla is, she is not a fool. She knows what returning would cost her. He reached over, took Ophelia's hand, threaded their fingers together, in a gesture that had become, over the months, so natural she barely registered it anymore, except in the quiet warmth it always brought. "The war is over, amore. I know it does not always feel that way. I know the fear does not simply vanish because the danger has passed. But it is over. We are safe. All four of us." Her free hand drifted instinctively to the now unmistakable curve of her stomach, 5 months along and finally gloriously visible. And she let herself, for the first time since the warehouse, believe him fully. Life had reassembled itself around them in the aftermath, changed but not broken. Ophelia had finished her rotations and would graduate medical school within the year, had continued performing, though now with a private security detail that trailed her to every rehearsal, with a discretion Lorenzo had insisted upon, and she had, eventually, stopped resenting. Matteo had returned to school with an ease that spoke to his own remarkable resilience, had taken up, with his father's encouragement, a fierce and unexpected passion for the violin himself, insisting that Ophelia teach him every evening after homework, filling the penthouse with the earnest, imperfect scratch of a beginner's bow. And Lorenzo? Lorenzo had changed most of all, in ways Ophelia watched unfold with quiet wonder. The cold, calculating king who had first knelt bleeding in an alley had not disappeared entirely. He still ran his empire with the same ruthless precision, still commanded fear in every room he entered outside these walls, but within the penthouse, within the small, sacred circle of his family, he had become something Ophelia suspected even he had not known himself capable of. Soft, present, utterly, helplessly devoted. "Marry me," he said, one evening in late summer, with no warning, no elaborate staging, simply the two words dropped into the quiet of a shared dinner as though he'd been holding them for months and could no longer contain them. Not because of the child, not because it would be convenient or expected or wise for a man in my position. Marry me, because I cannot imagine a single day of the rest of my life that does not begin and end with you in it. Ophelia looked at him, this dangerous, devoted, thoroughly transformed man who had once told her in an alley in the rain that screaming didn't stop the bleeding, and understood that she had, somewhere in the wreckage and the wonder of the past year, stopped being afraid of the answer. "Yes," she said, and meant it completely. They married in autumn, in the small stone church from the photograph, the same church where Isabella had once sat with her infant son, a detail Lorenzo had insisted upon with a quiet, grieving reverence Ophelia understood completely. It felt right, somehow, to close the circle there, to let Isabella's memory witness, in whatever way the dead witness anything, the family her sacrifice had ultimately, improbably, made possible. The guest list was small and carefully curated. Dante as best man, Marisol seated proudly in the second row, a handful of Lorenzo's most trusted men positioned discreetly at every exit. Because some habits, Ophelia had learned, never fully disappeared, even in peacetime. Matteo, dressed in a small suit that made him look absurdly grown up, served as ring-bearer, with a solemnity that dissolved the moment he reached the altar, and simply threw his arms around both his parents at once, unable to contain his joy any longer. Ophelia wore her mother's veil, the one relic of her own lost family she'd carried through every foster placement, every hard year, finally set against a wedding dress simple enough to accommodate the 7 months curve of her pregnancy. And when she walked down the aisle toward Lorenzo, she watched this composed, dangerous, thoroughly formidable man dissolve entirely at the sight of her, tears tracking unashamed down his face in front of every person he commanded. "You once told me you were an idiot for not calling an ambulance," he said during his vows, his voice rough with emotion he made no attempt to hide. "You were right. I was an idiot. I have been an idiot my entire life, building walls around every soft thing, certain that softness was a weakness men in my position could not afford." His hand found hers, steady despite the tremor she could feel beneath his skin. "You knelt in the rain and undid 15 years of that certainty in 4 minutes. And I have spent every day since trying to become a man worthy of what you gave me that night. I will spend the rest of my life trying. I promise you that, Ophelia. Not with the easy words of a man who has never broken a promise, but with the full weight of everything I am, everything I have built, and everything I still intend to become, for you and for our children." Ophelia's own vows, when her turn came, were simpler, but no less true. "I told you once that I didn't need anything from you," she said, smiling through her own tears. "I was wrong about that too. I need you, Lorenzo Bianchi. Not your money, not your power, not the safety you've built around us, though I am grateful for all of it. I need the man who knelt in his own study and put his forehead against my stomach and wept because he couldn't believe he was allowed to be happy twice. I need the father who learned to make pasta badly because he wanted to cook for his son. I need you, exactly as you are, dangerous edges and soft center and all of it. I choose you, today and every day after." The ceremony ended in an explosion of applause and tears, and the reception that followed unfolded in the golden light of the church's small garden, string lights strung between old olive trees, a small chamber ensemble Ophelia had assembled from her conservatory friends, playing pieces she'd chosen herself. No Bach tonight, no grief-laden chaconne, but something lighter, something built for joy rather than mourning. Lorenzo pulled her aside during the reception, away from the noise and the well-wishes, to a quiet corner of the garden where the string lights cast everything in soft gold. "I have a gift for you," he said, producing a small, worn violin case she didn't immediately recognize. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, was an instrument clearly decades old, its wood warm and rich with age, a small silver plate inlaid near the scroll, engraved with initials that made her breath catch. "This was Isabella's," Lorenzo said quietly. "She played before everything, not professionally, but she loved it. I found it in storage among her belongings, the ones the state finally released to me after she died. I wanted you to have it. I thought—" His voice caught. "I thought it seemed right, that the violin should pass to the woman who raised her son with more love than either of us managed to give him in those early years. A kind of thank you, from both of us." Ophelia held the instrument with the same reverence she'd have held a relic, tears streaming freely, and understood in that moment that her strange, impossible family had somehow, against every violent odds stacked against it, assembled itself into something whole. Isabella's love and sacrifice, her own years of quiet devotion, Lorenzo's fierce, transformed heart, all of it woven together into a single, unbroken thread that would carry forward into the child she carried, into whatever future they built from here. "Thank you," she whispered, and he kissed her beneath the string lights, and somewhere behind them, Matteo shrieked with laughter as Dante spun him in circles across the grass, and the music played on, unbroken, into the deepening blue of the autumn evening. Their daughter was born on a bright morning in early winter, 6 weeks after the wedding, in a private hospital wing secured with the same careful discretion that had come to define every corner of their family's life. They named her Isabella, after the woman whose grief and sacrifice had, in the strangest and most improbable way, made their entire family possible. Ophelia held her daughter for the first time, with Lorenzo's arm braced around her shoulders, both of them weeping openly. Matteo pressed close against his father's side, peering at his new sister with the wide-eyed wonder of a boy who had spent the last several months insisting, with absolute confidence, that he would be the best big brother in the history of the world. "She has your eyes," Ophelia murmured, watching the infant's unfocused gaze drift toward her father's face.
She has your stubbornness already, Lorenzo said, a smile breaking across his face that still, after all these months, transformed him utterly. The cold kingpin the city feared dissolved entirely into a man undone by love, holding his newborn daughter's tiny hand in his own, with a tenderness that would have shocked anyone who had only ever seen him across a negotiating table. I watched her fight the nurse who tried to swaddle her too tightly, 10 minutes old and already refusing to be contained. "Sounds like someone I know," Ophelia said, laughing through her tears, and he kissed her forehead, and for a long, perfect moment the small hospital room held nothing but the quiet miracle of a family finally, fully assembled. A year later, on a warm evening in late spring, Ophelia stood once more in the wings of the opera house where this entire impossible story had begun. Not as a struggling student this time, but as a guest artist, invited to perform the opening movement of a new commission written specifically for her, a piece the composer had titled, with a knowing smile Ophelia suspected owed something to a conversation Lorenzo had once had with an old friend, an unfinished symphony. She stepped out onto the stage in a gown far finer than the one she'd worn that first rainy night, violin raised, and found Lorenzo exactly where she knew he would be, front row center, Matteo beside him in a small suit he'd chosen himself with far too much confidence for a 10-year-old. Baby Isabella asleep against Dante's shoulder 2 seats over. The whole strange, beloved architecture of her family gathered to watch her play. The lights dimmed. The hall fell silent, that same holy silence she'd loved since childhood. 3,000 strangers holding their breath as one. She began to play. It was not grief this time, though grief still lived somewhere inside the music, threaded through every family's history like a scar that never fully vanished. It was not the desperate, hungry loneliness of the chaconne she'd played for Lorenzo, alone in his penthouse all those months ago, before either of them understood what they were building. It was something new, a piece built from loss and rescue and impossible coincidence, from a stabbed stranger in the rain and a lost son found and a daughter born from all of it. Every dissonant chord finally resolving, movement by movement, into something whole. She watched Lorenzo's face as she played, watched the same emotion crack across his careful composure that she'd witnessed that very first private recital. Watched him press a kiss to the crown of Matteo's head without looking away from her, and understood, with a clarity that settled deep into her bones, that this was the answer to every fear she'd carried since that first terrible night. That love, even love built in danger, even love that had nearly cost them everything, could still, against every violent odd stacked against it, become something unbreakable. The final note rang out and hung in the vast silence of the hall, and for one suspended heartbeat, nothing moved. Then the applause broke, thunderous, and Ophelia lowered her bow, tears streaming freely down her face, and found Lorenzo already on his feet, applauding louder than anyone in the entire hall, his eyes locked on hers with a devotion that had only deepened, grown steadier, in every month since a stranger had bled onto her hands in an alley and changed the entire architecture of her life. Later, after the crowds had thinned, after the well-wishers and the reviews that would call her performance transcendent had faded into the ordinary quiet of a family walking home together through a city finally, fully at peace, Lorenzo caught her hand outside the opera house doors,
the very spot where she'd once knelt in the rain over a dying stranger, and pulled her close.
"Do you know what I thought?" he said quietly. "The very first time I heard you play, months before that night in the alley. I used to come to your performances anonymously, sit in the back, and think that I had never heard anything so alive in my entire life. I funded your scholarship because I owed a debt to your mother, but I kept coming back because some part of me, even then, understood I was already falling in love with a woman I hadn't even properly met. You never told me that. I'm telling you now." He brushed a strand of hair from her face, the city lights catching in eyes that had lost none of their winter sea intensity, though the ice in them had long since melted into something warmer, softer, entirely hers.
Our whole story started with an unfinished piece of music, Ophelia, a debt I couldn't pay properly, a son I couldn't find, a grief I thought would never resolve. You finished it, every part of it. You are the reason the symphony is complete. She rose onto her toes and kissed him there, on the same stretch of sidewalk where their entire impossible story had begun. Matteo's laughter ringing out behind them as he chased Dante across the plaza, baby Isabella stirring softly against her father's borrowed shoulder, the whole bright, hard-won architecture of their family gathered close in the golden evening light. "It was never unfinished," she murmured against his mouth. "It was just waiting for the right hands to play it." Above them, the opera house glowed gold against the darkening sky, exactly as it had the night she'd first knelt in the rain and changed both their lives forever. And this time, walking away from it, there was no blood on her hands, no danger waiting in the shadows, only the quiet, hard-won promise of a family that had survived the worst the world could offer them, and had, against every violent odd, chosen each other still.